the rules, such as they are, they seem very commonsensical. They could apply to anyone. So is that a fair surmise of why you get so attacked? That just the very fact that you're willing to speak about the sexes as being not unequal, but
different but equal.
Yeah.
Well, I would say that that's part of it because there's a threat there. So one of the things that happened when I was in Scandinavia, I just wrote a column about this actually. It was interesting being in Scandinavia, especially in Sweden, because they've pushed the equality of opportunity doctrine farther than any other country in the world.
They invented it. It all started there, like in the UN, in the original, the charter. The Swedes were there. They've never given up.
No, and anyway, so I went to Scandinavia, and it was the same week that 2 studies were released showing what had already been established beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the personality differences between men and women, and the differences in interest as well, actually get bigger as your society gets richer and as it gets more egalitarian. And not just a little bit either. That's the other thing that's so interesting, is you might think, well, the effect is, it's the opposite of what the social constructionists would predict, first of all. So that's the first thing to point out, is it's not only that their hypothesis wasn't supported, it was decidedly refuted. And none of them have come to terms with that. And it's not a small effect. The difference between personality between men and women in Scandinavia is a lot larger than it is in non-egalitarian countries.
Like in rural Botswana.
But that's also true in the United States. The richer the demographic your household, the more likely the woman is to take time out and be at home with the kids.
Right.
Because she can afford to do it.
She can afford to do it. And she can afford to major in odd, low-paying fields, like, I don't know, feminist dance therapy or something.
Well, the other thing you see, too, is that one of the things that's also interesting, I think, is that, there's this idea that marriage is a patriarchal institution, that's primarily put there for the utility of the male. And you think, well, I think that's complete bloody rubbish, and I don't think there's any evidence to support it at all. But I think the best counter-evidence is that, well, if that's the case, then rich people shouldn't be getting married because they don't have to oppress themselves. But the truth of the matter is that the higher your demographic position, the more likely you are to be married. So marriage has fallen apart among,
And the more likely the wife is staying home, but not, she has all sorts of pursuits, but she's not.
Well, there's an old saying, any woman who marries for money earns it.
Yeah.
But now let me this is where you might get in a little trouble. Because in your book you call men order and women chaos. And you say, order, the known, appears symbolically associated with masculinity, and chaos, the eternal feminine, is also the crushing force of sexual selection.
Yeah, what's up with that?
Yeah, we chaotic.
Well,
you find us chaotic.
It isn't men and women that are order and chaos. It's masculinity and femininity symbolically. And so what's happened fundamentally is that our brains are wired for social cognition. So we're not natural scientists. We're natural sociologists. That might be a better, even though I shudder to think that might be true.
Especially given the state of sociology.
Yes, well, that's it.
Okay, triggering.
Or maybe,
triggering.
Yeah, or maybe we're more naturally people who observe through the lens of fiction, and that what we see is the world as characterized. And the world, obviously, is made out of men and women and children, and those seem to be our fundamental cognitive categories: masculinity, femininity, and then the category of children. And those categories have expanded to take on connotations outside of pure person perception. And so, it's for this reason that if you go to a movie, and maybe it's a Disney animated movie, and I like to talk about those because they draw on a very deep symbolic well, it's perfectly reasonable to see a witch that lives in a swamp, because those go together. Like, it makes sense. The witch doesn't live in a gleaming chrome high-rise. No. She lives in a swamp, because that's, and maybe in a shack.
Handy for her broom, I think. She could just fly out.
Well, that's it. Well, the high-rise would be better for the broom,
right,
because you could take off. You could take off better. But there are categories of symbolic association that are natural to the way we think, and the fundamental elements of those categories seem to be gendered. And so this is partly why I make reference to Taoism, for example. So for the Taoists, the world is made out of chaos and order. And chaos is the domain that you don't understand and that emerges unpredictably, but also the domain from which new forms emerge, right? Because it's from novelty that the new emerges. And I think the fundamental association between femininity and chaos is the association between what's unexpected and novel and what's new, because new forms emerge from chaos. And it's not that chaos is bad and order is good. That's
no,
not...
Both have their pathologies.
Both have their pathologies.
And their virtue. Yeah,
yes, and what you're looking for, and this is what the book concentrates on above all, is that you're looking constantly to find the balance between those two. So, for example, formally speaking, the domain of order is that place that you are when what you're doing is producing the results that you want to have produced. So imagine, think about the preconditions for not being anxious. Okay, so the preconditions are that you're constantly making predictions about what's going to happen next. And those predictions are tied tightly to your behavioral output. So you act in a certain way and you presume that a certain thing is going to happen. And if your actions produce the results that you desire, then you assume that you know where you are and you know what you're doing, and that your plan is intact, and that the environment is secure, and that keeps your anxiety under control. That's order. And then, maybe you're at a party and you don't know anybody, and you tell a joke and everybody looks at you like what you said was not only not funny, but also downright offensive. And then all of a sudden you've moved from the domain of order into the domain of chaos, because you thought you were somewhere, and you thought you were someone, and you thought you were with people that were of a certain type, and you got all that wrong. And so it
You're also suggesting it is going to be the woman who says, I find that really offensive.
Well, I'm not suggesting that.
But it probably is. Never mind.
But women are also more sensitive to negative emotion.
Right.
So there is some slightly higher probability that might be the case. But then I think women are also associated, at least in men's imaginations, with nature, which is part of the chaotic domain, say, as opposed to culture, because they're sexually selective. So you got to think, what is nature? I mean, we have that as a cognitive category, right? We think of the natural world, we think of nature versus culture. It's a fundamental opposition. What is nature? Well, nature is trees and landscapes and animals and all of that. But that isn't what nature fundamentally is. Nature fundamentally is that which selects from a genetic perspective. That's nature. That's the fundamental definition of nature. And it is the case that human females are sexually selective. And it's a major component of human behavior. So the evolutionary theory, roughly speaking, is that the reason we diverged from chimpanzees 8 million years ago, 7 million years ago, is at least in part because of the differences between sexual selectivity between female humans and female chimpanzees. Female chimpanzees are more likely to have offspring from dominant males, but it's not because of their sexual selectivity. So a female chimpanzee has periods of fertility that are marked by by observable physiological changes. Not the case with human females. Human female ovulation is concealed. So that's a very profound biological difference between human females and chimpanzees. And the chimpanzee females will mate with any male, but the dominant males chase the subordinate males away. But human females are sexually selective, and it's not a trivial fact. So you have twice as many female ancestors as male ancestors. You think, well, how can that be? Well, imagine that on average, every single human female has had one child throughout the entire course of history, which is approximately correct, by the way. Then imagine that half of the men had 0 and the other half had 2. Okay, and that's roughly the case. So half of males, historically speaking, have been reproductive disasters. And the reason for that is because of female sexual selectivity. So it is actually the case that female humans are nature. It's not only that they're associated with nature symbolically. As far as reproduction is concerned, they are the force of nature that does the selection. And so they're nature in the most fundamental way. And there is a chaotic element of that, at least in relationship to men, and also in relationship to women, because a lot of the female-on-female competition is competition that's chaotic for the right to be sexually selective, right? Not only with regards to men, which drives a lot of politicking, but also in relationship to each other, because part of what human females do is jockey for position in the female dominance hierarchy for the top position, which is the woman who gets to be most sexually selective. And so that drives female-female competition, and it's a different dynamic. There's similarities between female-female competition and male-male competition, but there are also differences, and they're pronounced. So men, for example, men are more likely to compete for socioeconomic status, and that's partly because that drives female mate choice. So the correlation for men between socioeconomic status and sexual success is about 0.6, and for women it's 0. Yeah. 0. In fact, it's actually slightly negative. Yeah. So, and that's a huge difference between men and women.
But do you know the anthropologist Sarah Hrdy? Hrdy. And she's like my favorite feminist theorist, although as she would say, I'm a theorist who happens to be a feminist, but she studied primate behavior, and she looked at the women the females and not women, very carefully, and looked at chimpanzees and gazelles and so on, and found that the female, initially, like male primatologists would look and say, oh, the males are dominant and the females are so cooperative. She looked more carefully and saw the females weren't exactly cooperative. Like they would pass around their infant, their baby, whatever they were, and would find, and so the male primatologist would say, oh, they're so kind and caring. She found out that when it was not it was not hers, they would take like little tufts of hair, it would come out, or they'd do something to the eyes, and the baby would like be injured, and she saw all this violence.
Especially true when there's status differentiation.
Yes.
So it's much more likely that'll happen when a higher status female is taking care of a lower status infant.
Exactly, and she said the great tragedy, well, not tragedy, she said the reality of our species, and in fact, the subtitle for her book is The Woman Who Never Evolved. We didn't evolve for niceness and cooperative. There's immense competition, and according to her, it's indelibly, marked in our nature to compete for the dominant males.
Oh, and yes, no doubt about that.
And
that seems true cross-culturally as well. That does flatten out a little bit in the more egalitarian societies. Yeah. So instead of being exaggerated, it does flatten to some degree.
Right.
So you could imagine that there's a biological component and a cultural component.
Of course,
and
both.
In that case, if you modify the cultural component, then that seems to decrease the overall. So, let me be more clear about this. Women are less prone to mate up, across and up status hierarchies in Scandinavia than they are in less egalitarian countries. But they're still prone to do it. So worldwide, for example, young women find men who are about 4 years older than them maximally attractive. And they tend to mate across and up status hierarchies. And so one of the consequences of that, for example, is that as women have entered the workforce, they've actually driven inequality, because rich women will only marry rich men as rich as them or richer, whereas rich men will marry women who are poorer than them, but women won't. And so what that means is it's another factor that's pooling wealth in the hands of fewer and fewer people.
It's assortative mating now, and you just find someone with your background. Whereas a doctor might have once married his secretary, he now marries another doctor.
Yeah.
Well, can I ask then, stepping a little bit back from primates as well, how does this selection work in the era of swiping right and left? What is your reaction to the way young people date today?
Oh, that's I was really hoping we'd get into that. I was really...
Well, you were very into the monkeys, so I didn't want to interrupt it.
No. Well, I should close off the Scandinavian discussion just by pointing out, and this is something that the Scandinavians are really going to have to wrestle with, is that if you institute effective policies to promote equality of opportunity, which the Scandinavians have done, you're going to produce some equality, so like a 50-50 distribution of men and women in the workplace, but you're also going to exacerbate certain kinds of inequality, and you can't get out of that. So you cannot have equality of opportunity and equality of outcome together. They don't work together. And equality of outcome, the essential equality of outcome doctrine, which is often described with the code word equity, is that at every level of every occupation, the people have to be represented by the same number that they're represented in at the population. So if it's not 50-50 men and women in each occupation and in each strata at each occupation, then that's sort of prima facie evidence for discrimination and for systemic discrimination. It's like, nope, sorry, you have to factor in choice, and choice actually turns out to be a very important determinant. And as the society gets flatter and flatter, choice becomes a more and more important determinant. And so what that essentially means is that the most radical end of the left-wing political agenda is logically impossible.